Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Today we got some more actual history for you from this book right here, The Pennsylvania German and the French and Indian War, a historical sketch. Now, in today's episode, we're finally going to get into the battles that started the French and Indian War. This was when the Delaware Indians attacked the Pennsylvania German settlers after the Delaware had been kicked off their land in eastern Pennsylvania by the Iroquois Indians and the Anglo settlers. At the point which we have now reached, it is well to bear in mind the fact that, by order of their masters, the Six Nations, or Iroquois Indians, the Delawares were forced to occupy the territory some distance north of the Blue Mountains, stretching from the Susquehanna to the Delaware River, having been driven from their former homes. Their principal villages were at what was called Shamokin, near the present city of Sunbury, and were strung along the east at various points in the Wyoming district. Naturally, hostilities started in the immediate vicinity of Shamokin. The opening shots, which were the precursors of the butchery that followed, are well described in a letter from Conrad Weiser, under date of October 28, 1755, which says, "Accounts from Paxton, October 20th, that some Indians had begun hostilities on the Susquehanna, and had killed or drove away all the inhabitants settled in the upper part of Cumberland County, at a place called Penn's Creek, about 4 miles south of Shamokin. 25 persons, men, women, and children, killed, scalped, and carried away on the 16th of October. 13 killed who were men and elderly women, and 1 child. The rest being young women and children carried away, a house burnt up. On the 23rd, upwards of 40 of the inhabitants of Paxton Creek went up to bury the dead, but found it already done. They went on to Shamokin to visit the friendly Indians there, stayed there all night, and in returning on the west side of the Susquehanna, and crossing the river on the morning of the 25th, at Mahoney Creek, were fired upon by a number of Indians that lay in the bushes. They lost several men. They killed 4 of the Indians. These Indians spoke the Delaware tongue. The news of the Indian murders up the Susquehanna spread fast. Conrad Weiser immediately alarmed the Tulpehocken neighborhood, whereupon the farmers at once gathered together, armed with guns, swords, axes, or pitchforks, whatever they chanced to possess, until some 200 had rendezvoused at Benjamin Spicker's, near Stouchburg, about 6 miles above Womelsdorf. Then the Reverend Mr. Kurtz, the Lutheran pastor who resided about a mile away, delivered an exhortation and prayer, after which Weiser divided the people into companies of 30, each under the command of a captain selected by themselves, and at once took up his march toward the Susquehanna, having first sent some 50 men to possess themselves of the Swatara Gap, through which it was expected the enemy would come. With those men, a letter was sent to William Parsons, who happened to be at his plantation. Their numbers increased rapidly on the way, until they arrived at Squire Adam Reed's house on the Swatara Creek, where they received intelligence of the surprise and killing of the settlers, who under the leadership of Captain McKee, John Harris, and others had gone to Penn's Creek to protect the people there and bury the dead. This seems very naturally to have dampened the ardor of the party somewhat, who began to realize how little could be accomplished by them in their present condition, and how they were foolishly leaving their own families unprotected. So they wisely determined to return, their way back being materially hastened by the rumor that 500 Indians had already made their way through the Swatara Gap and killed a number of people. In the meantime, the advance guard of farmers with their motley array of arms met Mr. Parsons, and he tells us in a letter of October 31st to Mr. Peters at Philadelphia how he advised them to make a breastwork of trees at the Swatara Gap with their axes, promising to procure and send them a quantity of bread and ammunition. They got as far as the top of the mountain, where they fired their guns off in the air, alarming the whole neighborhood, and then they came back again, firing the entire way, to the great terror of the inhabitants. Other brave men, inexperienced and undisciplined, have done worse under less trying circumstances. Soon came the news of the murder of Henry Hartman just over the mountains. As Mr. Parsons and his party were on their way to bury the body, they were told of 2 more who had recently been killed and scalped, and of others who were missing. Having decently interred the dead, they returned. It was a terrible time. The roads were filled with persons fleeing from their homes, and confusion reigned supreme. In the absence of provincial forts, the settlers began the erection of stockades, watchtowers, and the conversion of private houses into places of refuge. Among these were Squire Adam Reed's home, of which mention has been made, Peter Heidrich's home near the Swatara Gap, which later became Fort Swatara, and Dietrich Six's place near Millersburg, later the site of Fort Henry. Of Peter Heidrich it is related that when on one occasion the Indians appeared in considerable numbers during the absence of his neighbors from their own houses, he took down his drum and fife and marched himself boldly into the woods or thickets, alternately beating the drum, blowing the fife, and giving words of command to an imaginary body of troops, by which means he managed to keep the Indians away and also collect his neighbors. So these were some of the first battles in Pennsylvania of the French and Indian War. So if you want to hear more about this, you can check out the playlist that this is included on. This is actually episode 3. The first 2 episodes tell about the settling of the Iroquois and the Delaware in Pennsylvania and New York, and how the Iroquois conquered the Delaware and drove them from their original land. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.